Thanks, Joan. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to you all for being here. It's not every day that one gets to do a Beck talk, and I'm looking forward to getting feedback on these ideas, which are partially new ideas from a book that I've been working on. And the talk is a bit ambitious. I've packed a lot in here, so I'm going to talk at some points rather quickly, try to get you the gist of things on some data slides, maybe go through them rather quickly. So if you miss anything, feel free to ask clarifying questions, and I'll try to leave plenty of time at the end for discussion. So some of you may be aware that the Coachella Music Festival recently happened outside of Palm Springs. This is, I believe, the largest music festival in the world now. Something like 100,000 people, on the order of 100,000 people, went to this festival over a period of 2 weekends. And at Coachella, there was a performance by these two individuals. On the left is Snoop Dogg, one of the world's most famous rappers. And on the right is Tupac Shakur, also one of the world's most famous rappers, who died in 1996. So at this concert, Snoop and Tupac did a duet in which Snoop performed live and Tupac performed dead. So his electronically controlled avatar was projected onto some kind of a screen, three-dimensional screen, to create a hologram, which then interacted with Snoop in a live performance. Now, some people regard this kind of thing as a major problem for my field of research, which is evolutionary psychology. The reason is that evolutionary psychologists study mental mechanisms, the mechanisms inside of our minds, and how those have been shaped over evolutionary time, which means over many, many generations. And evolutionary psychology, like psychology in general, sees the mind as being populated by a host of what you might think of as algorithms or bits of computer software designed by evolution, which take in inputs, process them in certain ways, and then produce outputs in the form of representations, judgments, decisions, and so on. And so if the mind of Snoop Dogg is a series of computer programs which have been designed by natural selection acting over evolutionary time, if this computer is anything like this computer, or the computers that you have, when it's confronted with inputs that it's not designed to process, one might expect Snoop Dogg's mind to do this. Either blue screen, output a failure to compute, or at the very best, just not be able to do anything with the input. But of course, that's not what happened at Coachella. Snoop Dogg and Tupac got down as if nothing had happened. And so in this case, it's as if evolutionary novelty ain't no thing. Now you might think that I've picked a particularly extreme example, and there's no question this is an extreme example. This is an event that occurred, we can say with fair amount of certainty, this is the first time this has ever occurred in human history, when a man did a duet with a dead person, and it was viewed by hundreds of thousands of people, none of whose minds blue screened, as far as we know, when they saw this.
Or not for that reason.
Or not for that reason. So, okay, and this involves millions of dollars of technology and so on. So maybe I've picked a strange example, but I think a few moments of introspection will lead you to agree with me that, in fact, we're surrounded by evolutionary novelty all the time. In this room, we're immersed in evolutionary novelty, and our minds are capable of dealing with it. So if you have a television set, which is itself an evolutionary novel artifact, then this claim of novelty probably won't seem too surprising to you. Not only is the television set evolutionarily novel, but the content that we see in our televisions is also content which has never before been seen by a human being in the course of human history. On the show Toddlers and Tiaras, for example, this is a show in which people dress their toddler daughters up in beauty contests. And so you see things like 4-year-old girls with fake breasts, something that probably has not been seen by humans over most of evolutionary history. So the inputs that we get are, it's safe to say, outside of the realm of things that we've encountered. Again, you might say, okay, there's something special about this. These shows are perhaps a recent invention. Over the last decade or so, only a very small portion of humans have to deal with these kinds of inputs. But there are many other cases of evolutionary novelty as well. So one aspect of humans that anthropologists, like my colleague Rob Boyd, are fond of pointing out, rightly so, is that humans live in unusual social arrangements that are probably, in many dimensions, evolutionarily novel, including the size of the social groups that we interact with and the nature of those interactions as well. And we're able to interact in these ways, again, without a failure to compute. We can argue about and we can investigate whether what people do in these situations is adaptive or not. But there's no question that people are able to deal with these kinds of situations. Moving from televisions, there's a whole variety of artifacts where we see people interacting with artifacts that are evolutionarily novel. And including, for example, cases where you can use controllers, and now you don't even need the controllers. You can just move your body in front of a device that detects your body motions, and doing so controls an avatar on a screen. Something, again, that probably no human has ever has never experienced until recently. What's interesting here, and what we'll return to, is that all of these artifacts are culturally evolved artifacts. They've evolved through a process of cultural evolution to be able to be usable by humans. And they wouldn't exist unless they had gone through a process of cultural evolution where at each step of the way they were in some way dealable with by the human mind. And so it's not just the perceptual and motor interactions that we have, but other things as well. So technologies like Facebook change the way that we interact with other people socially, probably in evolutionarily novel ways. There are programs like Second Life where you can create an avatar of yourself that looks any way that you want and use it to interact with other people who have chosen avatars that look any way that they want. And these immersive environments, like the movie Avatar, what's interesting is after about the first 15 minutes of that film, everything that you're seeing is evolutionarily novel. You're sitting in a movie theater, every single pixel on the screen is computer generated, and you're seeing environments that don't exist on Earth, situations that violate the laws of physics, like giant floating mountains, and these blue creatures, which are not human, and have distorted faces that are distorted with respect to human faces, and yet we have no problem interpreting their facial expressions and understanding what's going on in the movie, again, as if nothing unusual had happened. And then there's my favorite domain of evolutionary novelty, which is food. I think this slide speaks for itself. So I titled my talk Confronting the Puzzle of Evolutionary Novelty, and I've been trying to decide whether I should call this a puzzle or a paradox, because in some ways it fits the classical definition of a paradox. So this is the definition from the OED. Paradox is a statement or proposition which, despite sound or apparently sound reasoning from acceptable premises, leads to a conclusion that seems logically unacceptable or self-contradictory. And so the premise here is that adaptations can only have been shaped by objects, situation, cues, and events that existed at some point in the past. That seems right to me. That seems like a completely sound premise. And the conclusion is, therefore, any capacity to deal with objects, situations, cues, and events that did not exist until now, or very recently, cannot be due to adaptations. I'm going to say that that's wrong. What seems paradoxical or puzzling here is cannot be due to adaptations seems maybe not logically unacceptable, but just sort of probably wrong. It may not be a logical error, but it's very, very unlikely that all of the things that I just showed you, our capacity to deal with those things, it's very unlikely that there's not some set of adaptations that is involved in allowing Snoop to perform successfully with the dead Tupac Shakur. Now, the standard solution to this problem is this. The standard solution says our ability to deal with novel things, of course, must involve adaptations, but they cannot be adaptations, quote, for those things. They must be adaptations for something else. And the two general kinds of solutions that are on offer are either general purpose mechanisms, like general purpose learning mechanisms, or what's sometimes called exaptation, which is essentially serendipitous or felicitous use of adaptations for something that they weren't designed for. So it's a lucky accident that there happens to be some mechanisms that enable Snoop Dogg to interact successfully with Tupac. That would be the exaptation view. The general purpose learning view would be that there's some general purpose mechanisms, nothing specialized, that allows him to interact successfully. Now this view is actually quite common in psychology and I think in the social sciences more generally. I'm going to call it a dual systems view. There's many definitions of this idea of dual systems, but this is perhaps the most prominent one. This is a psychologist, Keith Stanovich, who wrote this book called The Robot's Rebellion, in which he extends a metaphor originally proposed by Richard Dawkins, the metaphor of humans or organisms as robots controlled by their genes, and said, well, maybe it's true that we're robots built by genes. How can we then supersede in some way the imperatives that our genes build into us? And Stanovich proposes that the brain is composed of two different kinds of algorithms. One is called System 1, what he calls the autonomous set of systems, and he glosses this as, quote, the parts of your brain that ignore you. And these are essentially what he points to what evolutionary psychologists would call evolved specialized modules. He contrasts those with System 2, what he calls the analytic system, mechanisms which are domain general, conscious, not automatic. Essentially, these mechanisms are the you, quote unquote, that System 1 ignores, in his view. And this sounds all very fancy. You might notice a resemblance to the ancient idea of the difference between reasoning and instincts here. That this is essentially the distinction between reasoning and instinct that's been modified and made into a 21st century idea. Okay, so maybe Stanovich is not a good example. Perhaps this is some kind of minority view. It's actually the view advocated by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman. You might have seen his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is currently on the New York Times bestseller list. And he has this exact same idea. Indeed, this is a figure from his Nobel Prize lecture in 2002. The only psychologist to have won the Nobel Prize in economics, by the way. And so he contrasts perceptual mechanisms, intuition, which is System 1, and reasoning, which is System 2. Exact same definition of System 1 and System 2 that Stanovich uses. And he says, from its earliest days, the research that Tversky and I conducted was guided by the idea that intuitive judgments occupy a position perhaps corresponding to evolutionary history between the automatic operations of perception and the deliberate operations of reasoning. So Kahneman himself, if you read his writings, doesn't really commit strongly to the view that this is the part that's specialized and built by evolution and this part isn't, but at least there's that hint there. And others do, like Stanovich, do explicitly say the System 1 stuff is the evolved adaptations. Here's another quote from Chappé and McDonald, who have written several papers on this, who, quote, argue that mechanisms of general intelligence and domain general learning are powerful tools designed to solve problems not recurrent in the EEA. EEA is the environment of evolutionary adaptedness of these mechanisms. I'm not going to read this whole quote, but in the middle they say, the difficulty presented by novel problems is that by definition there's no characteristic input-output relation based on past recurrences that can solve them. And so they claim that you need domain general mechanisms to do this, and they point to exactly these same kinds of things, consciousness, reasoning, and so on. This part here is what generates a failure to compute on my part, because this doesn't make any sense if we're using the word design in the way that a biologist would use the word design. When a biologist talks about evolved design, what they mean is the features of the thing that have been shaped over evolutionary time by the situations that it encountered, which is the way we define EEA. So if there are domain general mechanisms, they have to, by definition, have been designed by something that happened in the past that generated their features. It's a logical impossibility that they can be designed to solve problems that weren't present in their ancestral environments. So this I think, presents two challenges to the standard dual systems view. The first one is it true that when Snoop interacts successfully with evolutionarily novel Tupac, is it entirely because of domain general mechanisms? It seems unlikely if you think about it, right? His perceptual system is dealing with the hologram of Tupac just in the way that perceptual systems seem designed to do. Is there conscious reasoning involved on his part? Maybe he had to be prepared for this before the performance by somebody telling him there's going to be a hologram or what have you. But it seems unlikely that during the performance he has to keep reminding himself, this guy's dead, this guy's dead, this guy's dead, right? His instincts, his intuitions are dealing with the situation just fine. And then the second question is, when mechanisms handle novelty adaptively, is it because those mechanisms were designed to solve problems not recurrent in the EEA, as Chappé and McDonald claim, or is it because they're designed to solve problems recurrent in the EEA that still exist? And that is the position I'm going to be taking here. That when they're handling novelty adaptively, it's because they're doing what they designed to do, for the most part. And so these kinds of problems that were recurrent in the EEA, that are in fact not evolutionarily new, are problems of learning and problems of dealing with variable properties of objects, people, and situations. And I'll be giving you a few examples to show that in fact it's a characteristic feature of brain mechanisms that there may be some exceptions, but most of them are in fact designed to deal with variation. And so the question that we need to be asking is, what kind of variation are they designed to deal with, and how? And so the proposal that I make in this book is that we should forget dualism. And by that I mean not that some of these distinctions that Kahneman and others make might not be true distinctions. So for example, it is an interesting question, why is some information in our brain conscious and some information in our brain is not conscious? Extremely interesting, extremely important evolutionary question. And it's worthwhile thinking about, what is the function of information getting into awareness, given that so much information processing occurs outside of awareness? Completely reasonable evolutionary question. But that's not the same as saying that the stuff that's outside consciousness is the evolved part, and the stuff that's inside consciousness is not the evolved part. And that's the kind of dualism that I'm saying we need to get rid of. And the dualism that carves everything into two categories, either specialized mechanisms or domain general mechanisms. Instead, we might choose to call some mechanisms domain general and domain specific. I'm not a huge fan of this distinction because, to me, calling something domain general is a kind of cop-out. It's a way of allowing you to say, well, I'm not specifying what this thing is for. As soon as you specify what it's for, you're specifying what the domain is, what type of information it was designed to solve. And so I don't like this distinction, but that doesn't mean I understand that it's a popular distinction to make. I understand what people are talking about when they use these terms. And so if you want to use those terms, fine. But the point is that our job is to describe all of those things in adaptationist terms. What are the design features that enable them to do what they do? And how do they interact with the world to produce our responses to novelty? So I want to propose now, I want to do two things. First, propose some conceptual ingredients, some theoretical ingredients that I think are going to be important for tackling this problem. And then I'm going to give you a few examples of empirical research that I've been doing with my colleagues. So the ingredients are going to involve at least two things. They're going to involve brains, and they're going to involve the world. And what's inside here includes things like genes, but not just genes, also developmental systems, what you might think of as the entire developmental system, which includes genes, but also epigenetic machinery, and what you might think of as designed interactions within the brain. Okay, so things like wiring rules for how the brain gets wired up, those can and are guided in part by events that are occurring in the lifetime of the individual, but they have been designed to achieve certain kinds of outcomes. And I've put feet on this brain because some people take the computer metaphor of the mind a little bit too literally and think that it's some sort of brain in a vat detached from the world. I personally am an advocate of embodiment approaches, which hold that the brain is actually inside the body, and the way that things get into the brain is through interaction of the body with the world. Again, something that seems hard to deny. Then on the other side of this equation, we have the world itself, and that includes not just the physical environments, but also culture, culturally structured environments, and the informational environments that we find ourselves in. What might this interaction be like? The simplest way of thinking of it is you've got the genes and the genetic stuff in here, and then you've got the environment, and you add those together to get humans. So something like the genes make a cake, the world makes the icing, you spread the icing on the cake, you get us. I think that's not quite right. To use a mathematical metaphor, I would say there's going to be some complex function of mind and world, which will generate humans, will generate what we're like today, but it's going to be very complicated, and it's our job to figure out, basically to describe this very, very large equation or function. I'm going to go very briefly over several ingredients that I think are important for this. One is evolutionary feedback. Another is hierarchical specialization. I'm going to talk about reaction norms, open and closed reaction norms, the concept of types versus tokens, and then finally talk about what I'm calling inductive bets. So first, the idea of evolutionary feedback. When we think about brain mechanisms evolving, this is a schematic. This gray square is meant to be a brain. And then this little square inside of it is some kind of a brain mechanism. Brain mechanisms evolve like anything through descent with modification. So if this is an ancestral species, the descendants of this ancestor will all have, unless it's lost somehow, they'll have versions of that brain mechanism. But the mechanism is modified evolutionarily over time. And evolutionary feedback just refers to the idea that changes here can alter selection pressures there, and in fact all through the evolutionary chain, meaning that say if this is humans and this is some other species of primates, part of the difference between us can have to do with the fact that there were changes in our environment that didn't happen for other primates. And these can actually be there can be feedback processes where in the case of culturally structured environments, things like language and so on, brain mechanisms are changing, which in turn changes the world that we grow up in, and that feeds back on the brain mechanisms themselves, leading to a kind of self-feeding process. And that's what I mean by evolutionary feedback. It's going to be critical for understanding human responses to novelty. Another idea is this idea of hierarchical specialization. This is from a paper in Press and PNAS, where I talk about the different ways that brain mechanisms, if they evolve through descent with modification, may result in what you might think of as hierarchically organized specialization. So if you think about, and this might be some brain system or mechanism or part or whatever term you want to use that has certain design features. And we can think about this on analogy to the way that we think about the evolution of limbs. My hands and feet or a bird's wings evolved from some ancestral design that had certain properties. And then over time, these properties change. And the important thing to remember is that adaptations don't have just one design feature. They often have multiple ones. And so the descendant versions of these designs can, for example, retain ancestral features like feature A, but also have some different features. So for example, there may be features of neural processing that stretch across brain mechanisms, but it doesn't mean that there can't also be specialized mechanisms that have those features. So there can be, for example, A might be, for example, certain kinds of input-output functions that neural networks have that are going to be true of neural networks in vision, and they might be true of neural networks in speech, and so on. And it's an empirical matter to find out what those might be. And part of this idea, too, is that brain mechanisms there's actually lots of suggestive evidence that as brains get bigger, as human brains have, they actually become more modularized. They get more and more parts, and those parts evolve through a process that's similar. It's basically a process of evolutionary duplication and divergence, where some ancestral part becomes duplicated, sometimes just through the process of expansion of brain tissue. You now have twice as much tissue, for example. And that can then select for differentiation of that tissue into different kinds of functional units. OK, I'll give an example of that in a moment. Another ingredient that I think is going to be important is thinking about reaction norms. So this is a typical kind of diagram of a reaction norm that you'd get from evolutionary biology. What a reaction norm is it's a function that describes the mapping relationship between genes, environments, and phenotypic outcomes. So typically what you'll see, a typical reaction norm will show you what a particular genotype will develop into as a function of what environment you put it in during development. And so, for example, there might be some relationship between the temperature that a plant experiences, or an animal, its body size, and its age. And I'm calling this a closed reaction norm. This is somewhat metaphorical here, because what I mean by this is we can imagine cases where the possibility space of the reaction norm has been fully explored by evolutionary history. And so the mappings between environmental parameters and phenotypic outcomes have all been tested in the crucible of evolution and have led to this kind of mapping. We can also think of open reaction norms, and this is a reaction norm. This is what I would say is the reaction norm of human language capacities when placed into different linguistic environments. These are any given human, if you make them grow up in these areas of South America, would end up speaking these languages, right? And so in a sense, we can think of that as the humans have some reaction norm. Empirically, we can describe it. When you take a human, you put it into a language environment, this is the language phenotype that you get. And it's obviously a variable response. And there's an interesting empirical question about what the nature of these reaction norms are. Why I'm calling these open reaction norms is that there may be some cases where there's a reaction norm that will result in an outcome when you put the organism into that situation. But there may be some parts of the norm that haven't yet been completely explored by evolution. And any given reaction norm, there's going to be, there may be dimensions of it, some of which are closed, some of which are open. And so, part of what you might imagine here, what I'm trying to evoke, is that if you make up some language like, say, Klingon, people have actually tried this. You can raise a child speaking Klingon to it. And in theory, it might be possible that the child could acquire Klingon as a language. Could happen, right? And that would be something where that's definitely, there's a reaction norm that's allowing the child to acquire that language, but the specific token of that language has never before been experienced by humans. And part of this idea of how reaction norms might be instantiated in the brain is a complex interplay between genes and both internal and external environments. So you probably know that the brain wires itself up during development. That wiring process we can think of as instantiating probably multiple reaction norms, where you take a genotype, you put it into the environment, and you can actually have different expression of different genes in different parts of the brain, both which can change how those respond to inputs. And the inputs themselves may actually be able to change what genes are expressed in different parts of the brain. We don't know a whole lot about this for technological reasons, but there's been interesting work on gene expression in the brain. This is actually work by a group at UCLA. Is anybody here part of this research? Because they could explain it a lot better than me. But basically what this does is this looks at gene co-expression networks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Where they look at statistically what genes are co-expressed with other genes, what genes are basically turned on together as a function of where they are in the brain. And what you see here is for humans and chimps, these genes that are co-expressed in, for example, cerebellum versus cortex versus other parts of the brain. And what you see is that, so you can think of this in a way, it's sort of an internal reaction norm, because developmental events in the brain during development are turning these things on in different places depending on things that happen. We don't know for sure whether external inputs play a role in affecting gene expression, but they certainly might. And what's interesting is that you see that the reaction norms of humans, in a way, are modified versions. Chimps and humans have modified versions of similar gene expression patterns. One of the ideas that I suggest in the paper and talk about a little bit is the idea of module spawning. So the idea that during development, if we think about these specialized devices as modules, early in development, there might be tissue that could go multiple ways depending on what happened. In that sense, you could call it sort of equipotential. It hasn't yet specialized. And we can think about different kinds of processes that will structure that tissue. One of them is what I might call type-generating processes. So what sorts of computational structure will the region adopt? What will be, and so you might think here of sort of different types, different areas of the brain might instantiate different kinds of input-output mappings, like, for example, many neural networks do something akin to a regression, averaging of inputs. But there can be other computational forms as well. You can think of those as types because there may be actually, this type, say, that instantiates a regression, a regression of variables could occur in multiple places in the brain. We can think about bifurcation processes. So if parts of the brain receive bimodal input, and we'll talk about this in a second with respect to object perception, if there may be mechanisms that say, I'm experiencing clusters in the input, that things are clustering in several ways, can there be procedures that say, OK, I'm going to then spawn different specialized regions to deal with those separate clusters? And then we can think of token generating processes. So when we think about, as I'll show you in a second, in object recognition systems, there's evidence, perhaps it's contentious, but there's evidence that we have specialized mechanisms for detecting faces, for recognizing living things like animals, and for recognizing artifacts. Those might be types that are present across all or most humans, but the specific tokens are going to vary. Right? So when we take the example of technological artifacts, all of us in this room, in your artifact recognition system in your brain, have information for recognizing certain kind of artifacts, which is not present in the brains of, say, the Shuar people that I work with in Ecuador, who would not know what an Xbox is. Right? The tokens are different. The tokens that appear across individuals may be different, even though the types are the same. And that's, I think, going to be quite important for thinking about novelty. This is an fMRI study of development of face and object perception that shows evidence consistent with this idea of sort of modularization, that early in development, you have PPAs, this specialized area for recognizing places, like this room. All of us who are familiar with this room, if you put us in a scanner and showed us a picture of this room, this area would activate. The FFA is a face area, and basically what you see is that over development, these areas become sort of more consolidated and more specialized. And one way of thinking about that is that, at birth, there's visual input going into the brain. At some point, object recognition areas in the brain start to become differentiated. And input to those systems may cause bifurcation into specialized areas for example, places or faces. Increasingly fine-grained discrimination as a result of inputs that you're getting. And often this is taken, the fact that these things have a gradual developmental trajectory is taken as evidence against specialization in the brain. People basically say, well, see, it starts out undifferentiated, and so this specialization is not the result of evolution, it's the result of a developmental process. In theory, that could be true, but the point I want to make is that this evidence that things gradually develop is not evidence against evolved specialization. From a biological point of view, what we want to ask is, has there been selection for development to produce a specialized place area and selection for development to produce a specialized face area? Admittedly, extremely difficult question to answer, but that's the question we should be trying to answer. And so if we were to do a phylogeny of these mechanisms, this is totally hypothetical, we might see some ancestral state in which there weren't specialized object perception systems, and over evolutionary time, they get selected for, so that we end up having distinct ones for different categories of objects we repeatedly encounter. Now, I've showed this word perception area here, and you might be wondering what that is. Here's a good example of reaction norms interacting with the world in a case of evolutionary novelty. This is research by Stanislas Dehaene and others on how the brain recognizes and processes words. Words and written language is a good example of evolutionarily novel inputs to the brain because written language doesn't have a very long history. It's possible that there's been some selection in some, to be able to read, but it can't be more than a few thousand years and only in some parts of the world. Dehaene, in this book, which I highly recommend, it reviews a lot of evidence and cleverly looks at evidence for basically design, that there appears to be design of this system to recognize words, which seems strange. So design features include, for example, font invariance. There's a part of the area that recognizes words that is insensitive to font. You can show the word in whatever font you want, and it will activate that area. And what's interesting about that is, in some of these cases, there's actually no perceptual overlap between the letters in these words. So this L in novelty shares basically nothing in common with this L in novelty. It turns out that there's also length invariance. It actually doesn't matter how long the word is. In adult readers of languages, the speed of processing is the same for a 3-letter word and a 20-letter word. And there's other interesting features as well, like this sentence, which I will wager, although I can't prove it, that nobody in evolutionary history has ever read before. Your brain is processing it with no problem at all. And it turns out that you can do things like drop out certain letters, and it doesn't change your perception of the sentence. So Dehaene talks about a bunch of these different design features and uses brain data to show, for example, this is showing that this area, the visual word form area, is sensitive to entire words, meaning that if you just show consonants alone, it doesn't activate this area. You show whole words and it activates this area. It looks like it's specialized for detection of these entire things. And they have a model that's sometimes called the pandemonium model in cognitive psychology, where features are built up from smaller features into larger aggregates of features. So there are mechanisms that look at individual letters and so on, but then they build up finally a representation that has features like it's invariantly sensitive to font. And actually, that kind of thing is characteristic of object perception more generally. So there are areas of your brain, your face recognition system is actually insensitive to the orientation of your face. There are areas which, if I show you Barack Obama's face, it doesn't matter which way it's facing, that area will be activated by that face. And it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view that at a certain level of representation, you want it to be invariant to how it's presented. It makes sense. It turns out that's true of words. How is that? That seems quite odd. A final piece of the puzzle is work by this guy, Mark Changizi, who came and gave a Beck talk about this a few years ago. And he did this work showing that actually letters of written languages evolve. It suggests, anyway, that letters of written languages culturally evolve through a process of variation and selective retention of letters that were better able to read. A bizarre idea, but what they did was Changizi noticed that letters have particular kinds of junctions, like a Y junction like this. And that Y junction, there's actually detectors in your brain that detect Ys. Why is that? Because there's a Y junction in a cube. And if you look around this room, you'll see that there's various kinds of junctions in the room. And some of these exact right angles are probably rare. But there are actually, even in a forest, if you look, there are different kinds of overlapping branches and so on. There's a distribution of junctions that are present. They took a sample of letters from the world's languages and then a sample of images and coded them for the frequency of these different kinds of junctions. And this is the resulting graph. For each of these junctions, this shows the frequency on a logarithmic scale of that kind of junction in images of the world, and then the dotted line is in letters of the world's languages. So an astonishingly close overlap, suggesting that this doesn't seem like it's a random thing. It's that letters that we're better able to distinguish between because they look like natural objects are ones that get retained. And in the book, he actually goes through how writing systems look like the earliest versions actually were not very good in this way, and they get better over time. And so, strangely, this word perception area develops in everybody who's exposed to words. Probably, we wouldn't want to call it an adaptation, but it's probably a token of a particular type of brain structure for object recognition, combined with a module spawning process that says, this is this special class of stuff, let me generate a particular module that handles it because it has recurrent features that I'm seeing over and over again. So there is adaptation involved, but it's a reaction norm that's interacting in an interesting way with novel inputs. The last concept I want to tell you about, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about, is the concept of inductive bets. Now, this is actually a concept that is present in evolutionary psychology without this name per se, and present in evolutionary biology more general. I've given it this particular name for the purposes of, well, one reason is because I think that thinking about adaptations as instantiating inductive bets actually changes a little bit our way of seeing them. Typically, adaptations are seen as sort of rigid, they're inflexible and capable of dealing with novelty. But if we think about them as in terms of the bets that they instantiate about the world, we can get a better handle on how they could be expected to respond to novel situations. So induction is a form of inference that involves making a general inference based on specific pieces of data. And we're doing induction all the time. Of course, there's conscious inductive inference that we might do. But you can also say that our brains are doing inductive inference all the time because they're using particular points of data and extrapolating generalizations from them. Here's an example of inductive inference. If I show you this animal, some of you may know what this is. It's a pangolin. But imagine that you don't, and you see this animal walking along, and you see the animal eat a scorpion. Most humans, upon seeing that one piece of data, would encode pangolins as the kind of animal that eats scorpions. And if they saw a pangolin in front of a scorpion a second time, they would not be surprised if that animal also ate the scorpion. And what's interesting there, if we think about this from a Bayesian point of view, in terms of the priors that we have, you probably wouldn't have a prior or it would be a very small prior that pangolins eat scorpions. If you had no data, and I asked you to guess, the probability would probably be low that you would nominate that as the diet of a pangolin. Once you see this data point once, though, you change your prior about the diet of pangolins radically. And so you are betting that that piece of information has a certain validity to it. The example that I use in the book is the example to illustrate inductive bets is phototaxis in bacteria. So many animals respond to light, and there's been really interesting research on the system in bacteria that allows it to respond adaptively to light. So this is a great paper by Foster and Smith from 1980 where they do the engineering analysis of this, and there's been a lot of work on it since. But these are paths of a bacteria that starts moving at A. At time B, a light is switched on at C. And when the light is switched on, you can see that the bacterium changes its path and goes towards the light. And I won't go into the details because they're incredibly complicated, but essentially what you have in these bacteria is a detection system, a light detection system, attached through a signaling chain to flagella, which are whips on the surface of the animal. And so what happens is the light detection is direction sensitive and adjusts the way the flagella move as a function of which way the light is hitting the bacterium to orient it and steer it towards the light. And Foster and Smith call this a directional antenna designed to match the environment of the organism. And they've actually gone into, you can actually look at the nature of the mapping function that maps between these inputs and outputs. I'm not going to even go into the details here, but it's quite complicated. And you can model it. So you can actually, this is here is a reconstruction of a particular phototactic cell with the whip on it. And you can make different assumptions about what the mapping function is between light and behavior, make a model and see how well does that fit the animal's behavior. And when you do that, you get different kinds of phototactic behavior. What these people are doing is basically using modeling to try to figure out what is the shape of the inductive bet function that this bacteria has with respect to light. And what's interesting here, an important feature that we have to keep in mind about inductive bets, is they are fit to the world, as Foster and Smith say, but they're fit statistically to the world. So this is an example of positive taxis. This is actually chemotaxis, where there's a gradient of chemicals here. And these are data from real worms, in this case, that move. They like to move towards the center of the gradient. They're betting that there's something good there. You also have negative taxis, where here's a repellent source, and animals can also move away from it. And what you see is that, in fact, so in this case, these organisms are betting that that's a bad thing and want to stay away from it. And their movement is actually has a lot of randomness to it. It's a biased random walk. So it's not perfect, but it's got statistical shape to it. And so what I want to think about here is, when we think about novelty, is how inductive bets are modified by the evolutionary process. And there can be ancestral inductive bets that then are changed. So for example, in humans, we may have many inductive bets that predate the human-chimpanzee split, and there may have been further modifications and addition of different kinds of inductive bets into our brains. And so what I'm thinking of are things like Bayesian models, where this is an example from a paper by Tenenbaum and Griffiths, where they model a system that's designed to guess for a given number on a single dimension of integers, for example. If you get that as data, if the organism gets that, what's the probability that it was drawn from a particular distribution of underlying sets of numbers? And you can model this quite precisely with probability densities. So there's some probability that it came from a very broad distribution of numbers, and there's another probability that it came from a narrow distribution, and you can use models to look at basically the relative plausibility of those different hypotheses, and systems can be shaped that basically bet, they're making an inductive bet, I think, that it was drawn from this distribution with this probability. And we're doing that when we do things like learning languages, learning words. We're gradually forming better and better bets about what words mean, how they can be combined in utterances, and so on. And so the question is, one important question is, are there different inductive bets for different domains? How can these be shaped by learning? Some of them are going to come with priors that are specified evolutionarily, and so on. So now let me turn to two studies that I've been doing with colleagues and students that illustrate some of these ideas. Okay, the first one is work that I've done with my colleague Andreas Wilke on the hot hand phenomenon. And this has gotten a lot of research in cognitive psychology. The work originated with this paper by Tom Gilovich and colleagues in 1985, looking at the hot hand in basketball. And this, by the way, is Amos Tversky, who did the research along with Kahneman that won the Nobel Prize that I was talking about earlier. And so what they looked at was, they call it the misperception of random sequences. So they're looking at the phenomenon where people think that basketball free throwers are on a hot streak at a particular moment, like they're getting a lot of baskets in a row. And to look at this, they took data. This is data from 1981 to 82 from the Celtics, looking at free throws. And what you see in these data are that each of these free throwers has some particular hit rate, what we'll call the hit rate. So they step up to the basket and they start trying to make baskets, and there's some percentage success that they have. Larry Bird was the best at this time. And so his hit rate was about 90% in this particular sample that they looked at. But here's what's interesting. This shows the probability of a hit following a miss, and this shows the probability of a hit following a hit. And what you see is that, in fact, Larry Bird hits about 90%, and it doesn't matter whether he just got a basket or not. He just has a hit rate, but his individual throws are not correlated with each other. And the same is true for these other players. And we can argue about whether there's correlations or not. It depends a little bit on the data set. But in most of these cases, if there is autocorrelation in the data, it's extremely weak. So these free throws are a bit like flipping a coin. But in Larry Bird's case, it's a coin that comes up heads 90% of the time. But every time you throw it, it has a 90% chance. And the coin is not affected by what you got on the last throw. But people think it is. So Gilovich and colleagues calculated this thing called the probability of alternation. So, I'll use this in our study as well. So if the alternation probability is 0, that would mean that if you get a hit, the next time you're going to get a hit, guaranteed. If the alternation probability is 1, then if you get a hit, next time you're going to get a miss. And of course, the alternation probability can vary between 0 and 1. In the case of a coin, the alternation probability is 0.5. And so they looked at alternation probabilities in the data, and then they asked judges to judge whether the throwers were on a streak. And it turns out that the lower the alternation probability is, the greater the judges think that the thrower is on a streak as opposed to shooting at chance. And so basically, they are misperceiving autocorrelations in these data. And it turns out that these alternation probabilities are based on very, very small samples. And as you know, if you flip a coin, it's actually quite likely that you'll get streaks, or rather sequences of hits in a row or misses in a row. There are going to be distributions of those in any sequence of coin tosses, but they don't indicate autocorrelation. So there's been a lot of explanations proposed for this. Gilovich proposed what they called the representativeness heuristic, which was that people use small samples to extrapolate into larger samples. And there's been a variety of other explanations as well that I'm not going to go into. But what's interesting that Andreas and I noticed was that almost all the studies are in sports, gambling, or financial markets. The vast majority are in these domains. And so it doesn't seem likely that there's any adaptations in the brain for thinking about basketball, or financial markets for that matter. And so we started to ask ourselves, well, what might be the domain of this thing? And both Andreas and I had done research on foraging cognition before, and there started to be obvious parallels to things like optimal foraging theory, which models basically how organisms should make decisions as a function of how things are distributed in the environment. And there's lots of literature on what you should do when things in the world come in clumps. And we started to think about what kinds of things that humans encountered over evolutionary time, and we realized that most of the things that humans forage for, or foraging, I'm using it in the very broad sense, resources that are important to our fitness, are distributed in clumps. So of course things like food, but also social resources, right? Social allies, come in clumps, can come in clumps as well, and there are many other kinds of resources that you might think of. And so we thought, well, nobody's ever looked at whether this exists, whether this hot hand phenomenon exists in other domains aside from these very evolutionarily novel ones. Let's take a look. And so we propose that if hot hand might be an adaptation to clumped resources in general, it might be a kind of default that we would get when predicting items that are coming in a sequence, like of hits or misses. And then the question becomes, would come, what are the cues that activate it? Are there domains within the hot hand? Are there cases where we would expect it to see it activated or not activated? What might those be? We suggested there might be different effects for hits than misses, right? If you might pay special attention when you get a bunch of baskets in a row, not when you get a bunch of losses in a row, although of course both of those could be important. And then we wanted to find out, can we ever turn it off? And there's another fallacy in literature called the gambler's fallacy, which is basically, I just got a bunch of tails in a row. I better switch to heads because the tails are all used up, right? And gamblers sometimes do that, and we think, although we still don't have evidence for it, that could be some kind of a depletion psychology. When you're getting resources that are being used up, you might then switch. So what did we do? I'm going to go through this pretty quickly just to give you a sense of it. We did 2 experiments, one with UCLA students, that's a more detailed experiment, and then a subset of our study we did with UCLA students and Shuar people at my field site in Ecuador. It's a very simple game. Subjects see a resource, a picture of a thing, come up, and they have to judge. Do they think that the next space is full or empty? So in this case, it's a ripe fruit, and so what they saw was either ripe oranges or unripe oranges. And they had to predict, is the next one going to be a ripe orange or an unripe orange? And what we wanted to find out, can we push this effect around by changing the domain? So we looked at 2 dimensions, natural versus artificial. So we picked fruits on trees and birds' nests as examples of natural resources, and then bus stops and parking spaces as examples of resources that UCLA students would be familiar with. Maybe naturalness is the cue. Maybe. Another dimension we manipulated was whether students had the intuition explicitly stated that they were clumped or dispersed. Of course, clumping and dispersal depends on the spatial scale that you're measuring it at. But we did interviews with, basically questionnaires with students to get their intuitions about these resources. And fruits are the kinds of things where if you find a tree that has a ripe fruit on it, it's probably got other ripe fruit on it, right? You're in a patch. Parking spaces are like that in the sense that all the white zones on the street in LA, right? If you find a white spot or a parking meter, there's probably a bunch of parking meters right there. And then it'll be followed by a long stretch of red curb where there's no parking meters. So those things come in clumps, and we verified that UCLA students think that. And then dispersed we use birds' nests because animals that have territoriality or competition often they have dispersed spacing. You don't want to have your nest exactly next to another bird's nest. You space them out so that you're not competing for space. And bus stops are like this in LA too, right? You don't have all the bus stops in Westwood all in one place. By design, the bus stops are evenly spaced. And UCLA students have this intuition. So we had to make these guesses with these resources with pictures of things like the parking space or the bus stop. They had to make 100 guesses. The true alternation probability was 0.5, so these were all like coin tosses. And we paid them 5 cents each time they got it right. And we computed this alternation probability, but we computed the subjective alternation probability from the subject's data. You can actually compute, are they sticking on what they just did or are they switching? And you can compute that as a running average across the study. And what we find is, I'm not going to go into all these in detail, but the take-home message is there's hot hand in every single one of these domains. And so the fact that these subjective alternation probabilities are lower than 0.5 means that our subjects were hot-handed about all of the resources. And if you graph this over the course of the experiment, 0.5 would be what the alternation probability really was in the data. And what you see is there's some variation, but if anything, they actually get more hot-handed over time, almost like they're looking for the clumps and trying to get clumpier over time. And if you look at where coins are, they're up near the top, but they're still not. So even though students say they know that this is a random device, their judgments don't reflect that. And we actually, surprisingly, really didn't find as many systematic effects, even though there's variation. there was a stronger hot hand following hits than misses, small main effect of natural versus artificial resources, no effect of whether they were actually clumped and dispersed in the subject's minds or in their explicit statements about them. And this trend downwards wasn't significant, but it's a trend. And interestingly, these students, this A means that they reported they were using an aggregating strategy, that they basically were looking for clumps. And so students who say that they know that coins are random devices, 50% of them are still saying they're looking for clumps when you ask them what they were doing. OK, now the other one was with Schwarr, adults and UCLA students. Because of experimental design issues, a small number of subjects, and so on, we picked two resources. We picked the coins, and we picked the fruits. Basically because we hadn't found big effects of the difference between those, but we know that UCLA students know about coins. The Schwarr people know about coins a little bit, but just don't. They conceptually know about a coin toss, but they don't use them for anything. And did basically the same experiment. So these are, the Schwarr people are foragers, people who actually go out and forage for resources, right? So it's an interesting question. Are their intuitions about this different, or their judgments different? And this is what we found. So both Schwarr and Schwarr people and adults and UCLA students are hot-handed in both domains. And the Schwarr actually were a little bit more than the UCLA students. So this is what it looks like graphically. The least hot-handed that you get is this top line, which is UCLA students making judgments about coins. The Schwarr are the black. So you can see that the Schwarr are more hot-handed than the UCLA students, suggesting that this seems to be some kind of a psychological default that applies across pretty broadly. And maybe, we don't know for sure, but it could be that the fact that this is getting as close as you can, as we've seen to 0.5, is that experience with coins is shifting people's priors about these, but it's still not getting rid of the hot hand all the way. OK, for the interest of time, I'm going to not discuss all these different effects, but we can come back to that if you want. And so the questions that remain here are, we're proposing it's an inductive bet that the brain is making. It's guessing that when things come in sequences, there's going to be clumps and is looking for them. We want to know what the priors are and how they're adjusted by experience. And can we find domain effects? We still haven't been able to do that. And then with respect to novelty, the question is, how does the hot hand affect our responses to novel situations? Sports, stock markets. I mean, could this be an evolved thing that's affecting our economy? Other kinds of stay or go decisions in the modern world. And Andreas and I have just got a small grant to use our instrument for measuring people's hot-handedness at a casino in New York to look at whether hot-handedness actually predicts whether people like to play casino games. So obviously, slot machines are an evolutionarily novel stimulus, but this is an example where we might be able to look at evolved inductive bets and how they're being transferred into this novel situation. The last research I want to tell you about real quickly is research that I've been doing with my students on prepared learning. And so prepared learning refers to the idea that not everything is easily learned. Some things are hard to learn, some things are easy to learn. And the idea of prepared learning is an old idea dating back to the 60s and 70s from the behaviorist literature that basically suggests that evolution may have made some things easier for us to learn than other things. And so I've been thinking about prepared learning strategies as inductive bets. When you remember something, your brain is betting, in a sense, that will be useful later. All the information that we're encountering, our brain faces this problem. Which of it am I going to store? There's a lot out there. And memory systems you can think of as instantiating inductive bets, that certain things are worth remembering and other things are not likely to be useful, and so we discard them. And so I started this looking in the domain of animals, and particularly looking at animal dangerousness. And there's a lot of surface plausibility to the idea that we easily learn information about animals, and in particular dangerous animals, so monsters in childhood, if you hear about them. I know I did when I was a kid, just very minimal information about the existence of a particular kind of monster. You would worry about that and think about it. What does it look like? Where does it live? Check under the bed. Little kids have this, right? And adults have it too. So there's actually precious little evidence for Bigfoot, but lots of people are pretty convinced that he's out there. And so this might reflect a system that's basically a sticky memory system that says, when I get this kind of information, keep it. And part of the logic of this actually comes from work by Rob on when you might expect social learning versus individual learning. And so in the case of dangerous animals, these are cases of very rare events. So learning about some animal that, most of the time predators, you don't see them all around you. It depends on what environment you grow up in. But for example, in Ecuador, kids know that there are jaguars, but you don't want to see, when you see one, it's pretty much too late. And so this is a case where you wouldn't expect the system to wait for actual experience for the world to learn that the thing is dangerous, but rather to be prepared to learn socially from others that this is a kind of animal, it looks this way, if you ever see it, run away because it's dangerous. And so that was the logic of this study. We've done a couple like this. And so the first one was a study I did in LA and in the Schwar. And we use a training card method where we show kids a bunch of animals that are novel to them, they've never seen before. And we have a control group that we show the cards and test them to see can they make any inferences from these cards. And you'll see the answer is they can't. And in this study, we showed them these 16 cards. And for each one, we said what it was called, whether it ate plants or animals, and whether it was safe or dangerous. The order of these things was randomized. And then we shuffle the deck. And we say, OK, now I'm going to test you to see what you remember. And we show them the card and say, do you remember what this one's called? Do you remember, does it eat plants or animals? Do you remember, is it safe or dangerous? We don't tell them whether they're right, so this is without feedback. We come back 1 week later and we do the exact same thing. So what do we find? We find evidence for prepared learning about danger where these are American kids and these are Schwar kids. If you look 0.5 on the binary judgments of naming, naming is not a binary judgment. So they basically don't remember the names at all. And then the diet is, does it eat plants or animals? They're pretty much a chance across the conditions there. But this danger information, can it hurt you or not, jumps from chance, which you'd expect in the control kids, right? They're not able to guess from the cards whether it's dangerous. As soon as you've trained them, right afterwards, after a single trial, they go up to 70% correct, which is well above chance on dangerousness. And you test them a week later, it's still there. So a single exposure to this, you show them a picture of a pangolin and you say this could bite you. A week later, they still remember that pangolin could bite you. We see the same effect in the US and Schwar. The effect is a little bit stronger than Schwar. These kids, this is a sample where the kids were about a year older on average. So we're trying to tease apart, is it an age effect? Or it could be an environment effect that they're more sensitive to this information because of where they grow up. But what's interesting is really these kids are from, these are kids actually, the children of UCLA professors tested on campus. And they're never going to get bitten by a pangolin. Right? But their brains are betting, making the inductive bet, that this information is going to be useful to them. And we're working on some follow-up studies now, with Willem Frankenhaus, who got his PhD last year and is doing a postdoc in Budapest, and then Chris Peterson, who's a first-year student. And what we've done is looked at, well, is this an effect? What's the domain of this effect? Is it, we started with dangerous animals, there was a logic there. Next thing you want to do is see, well, let's try other stimuli and see if you get the same effect. So we have artifacts, things like this, which kids don't know what they are. And we picked tool-like artifacts, particularly because we thought, well, if there's any kind of evolved domain, it probably has to do with manipulable tools, even though there are other kinds of artifacts around. We chose these. And then we had 3 properties. Safe, dangerous, do you use it inside or outside, or is it breakable or not breakable? And we haven't finished this study, but I'm going to show you the data from the first 20 kids. We don't have a control condition yet. But this is what we get from the first 20 kids tested in UCLA, or rather LA area daycares, is we see this effect of safe, dangerous. We see, and this is, again, a test at retest, so the information is sticking. We see a small effect that's probably not statistically significant of inside and outside, and not an effect at all of breakable, not breakable. By the way, this is kind of interesting because kids have sometimes been said to have a negativity bias, that they remember stuff that's bad. And this is not knockdown evidence, but kids probably know that they're not supposed to break things. They've probably been told that, and they don't seem to remember whether the thing that is breakable at all. And when you compare this is the LA data here, and then this is the artifact data to compare the effect sizes. And one of the interesting things is we're going to be able to use this method to actually look from a Bayesian perspective, what's the strength of the priors as a function of what the inputs are. And in this case, it's a similar effect size for the artifacts as it is for animals. This is a good example of pure empiricism. We did this to find out, to answer the question, what is the domain? We actually didn't know, because there are reasons to expect that you wouldn't find this effect for artifacts, both intuitive and theoretical. It's very hard to teach kids, don't play with daddy's gun, right? Apparently, that's a hard thing to teach, right? It looks like there is some effect in some kids, anyway. Over evolutionary time, you might think, well, why teach a kid that a tool that other people use all the time is dangerous? It could have come out that they wouldn't have this kind of learning. On the other hand, maybe we do need to learn about artifacts, the way to use it properly, and so on. So we're finding out that this effect holds for artifacts. And then, what if we extend the domain even more? So what we're currently doing, and I don't have the data to show you, is looking at foods, using the exact same method, flashcards, showing them novel foods, plant foods that they haven't seen before, and then telling them things like, is it safe or dangerous to eat? Where does it grow, in the mountains or the jungle? And so on, and seeing what they learn. And so we'll be able to hopefully map out the landscape of inductive bets in this, in the domain of danger learning. And this question, what are the inductive bets that our minds make about content, is actually unbelievably something that hasn't been very well studied. And what we need to do to try to map this out is to use systematic methods to figure out, what are the content areas in the world that we learn well about and under what circumstances. And how do those interact with evolutionary novelty to result in what we actually do learn. So in wrapping up, what I want to propose is sometimes domains, we think about domains as being mutually exclusive domains. So something is either an animal or it's an artifact. And when we think about the inductive bets that the mind makes, we might actually instead want to take a multidimensional view that domains can vary in what I'm calling formal structure. So things like the statistical distribution of the things in the world, like that the hot hand effect is looking at, distributions of stuff. In that case, the mind doesn't seem to care, is it a orange or is it a bus stop? But it is, to some degree, worrying about the distribution. There's category domains, artifacts, animals, people, language. And then there's what you might think of as property domains. So it turns out within the domain of animals and artifacts, danger is a property that's easily learnable. And it cuts across, this property cuts across animals and artifacts at least. And so when we learn things, in language learning and so on, there are a variety of cues that we might learn, like phonemic boundaries. And it can be the case that language learning is sensitive to, say, the statistical distribution of words and languages, which there's good evidence that's true. It could be sensitive to things like phoneme boundaries and so on. All these things can be true at once. And so our question is to sort of map this multidimensional function, not to treat these things as necessarily separate. And I think that we can think about this as how this function gets shaped in terms of descent with modification. So returning to Snoop's two questions, is it true that when we interact successfully with evolutionary novel items, is it entirely because of domain general mechanisms? We can argue about what domain general means, but these studies that I showed you suggest those seem, they have domains, they have design features that we can say what they are, and we can use experimental methods to ask what are the situations that they're deployed in and what have they been designed to do. They're domain specific in that sense. They're adaptations, and we can think about them. And then the second question is, when mechanisms handle novelty adaptively, is it because they're not designed to deal with anything, or is it because they were designed to solve problems that still exist? And I think that in the cases I showed you, and probably many others, there's a sense in which we can, in this multidimensional view, evolutionary novel stimuli, like Tupac, have certain properties that are, in fact, new, like the fact that he's a hologram and he's projected onto a screen. But he also has many properties that aren't new. He still looks like a person does. You can use person perception mechanisms to deal with him, and I'm sure that Snoop was doing that. And so in many ways, we're seeing mechanisms that are doing what they were designed to do and working properly. So there's a lot of work remaining to be done in this area. And what I've tried to do is propose a new way of thinking about it in some new conceptual tools, which hopefully will help us to map out the structure of how we deal with novelty and how we deal with situations that have never before appeared in evolutionary history, and in some cases, situations that will never again appear, if we're lucky. Thanks.